Um, so teaching for 25 years at UMaine Farmington's Division of Natural Sciences, Dr. Ron Butler has helped lead 3 major efforts that rallied community volunteers to gather information about Maine insects: the Maine Damselfly and Dragonfly Survey from 1999 to 2005, the Maine Butterfly Survey from 2006 to 2015, and the Maine Bumble Bee Atlas from 2015 to 2019. He just co-authored a book on the butterflies of Maine in the Canadian Maritimes and is now working on a similar book about damselflies and dragonflies in the region. Welcome, Ron, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'll hand it over to you.
It's my pleasure. So by way of background, I didn't start my career working with insects. As it turns out, I actually was a seabird biologist for the early part of my career. I worked in Antarctica, Newfoundland, and off the coast of Maine studying, penguins in some cases, but mostly puffins, gulls, guillemots, and leeches, storm petrels. And it wasn't until about 25, or a little more than that, years ago, that I switched my focus from cold, windswept, fog-bound, rainy island critters to critters that pretty much like to be out on sunny, warm days. I don't know what took me so long, but I did it. And so I got involved with citizen science programs in Maine, and those included initially the Damselfly and Dragonfly Survey. And when that ended, we started planning and then implemented the Maine Butterfly Survey. And when that one ended, after 8 or 9 years, we then pursued the Maine Bumble Bee Atlas, which just concluded, although we're still getting some records, about 2 years ago. And so it's now a question of which critter are we going to focus on next. I'm trying to push for native pollinators, particularly syrphid flies, flower flies, but the results of the Maine Butterfly Survey, as Ruth indicated, are going to be released in a book that should be available by the end of the summer. We're now working on the companion book, which will be even more field guide oriented, involving damselflies and dragonflies. So, I'd like to start out talking a little bit about dragonflies from a historical perspective, that is a human historical perspective, dragonflies in terms of human culture. So I sort through the literature and try to find early references. The earliest reference I can find to the appearance of dragonflies are on these stone seals used in Crete 1,500 years before the Christian era. And that doesn't look much like a dragonfly, but it's pretty worn. They certainly show up in Asian literature, particularly in Japanese poetry. They also show up in various places in Japanese culture in terms of family crests, the mon. So you can see them oftentimes on the handles of Japanese swords, the katana, or on this 15th century helmet. In Chinese art, 16th, 17th century, there's lots of dragonfly references. And the earliest inclusion of dragonfly references that I'm aware of is in the 1600s in Sir Francis Bacon's Silva Silvarum, the natural history in 10 centuries. When we look at how Western European culture refers to dragonflies, we can see kind of a negative aspect to critters referred to as eye stingers, eye stitchers, snake doctors, devil's needles, oar stingers, right? And you can trace the roots of those kind of Western European um, nicknames for dragonflies to the kind of cultural perspective that we find in Europe and America. So, for example, in Italy, dragonflies were apparently sent from hell by Satan to bother people. In Sweden, they were referred to as the devil's steelyard. Steelyard is a tool that's used to weight steel. And so if a dragonfly flew around your head, it was weighting your soul, and you could expect some delightful punishment as a result of that. My grandmother was always fond of telling me that if I lied, darning needles would stitch my lips together. Thank you, Grandma, for that delightful memory. But if you switch cultures and look at Asia, there's a different perspective. So, for example, in Japan, the dragonfly is seen as the spirit of success, harbinger of harvests. China, symbol of summer and instability. Instability probably referring to change. Vietnam, symbol of transition. Indigenous peoples, the Dakota, regarded as a medicine animal, a witch's animal, associated with mirage and illusions. The Hopi and Pueblo peoples, again, a medicinal animal associated with healing and change. The Navajo, that's a kind of drawing of a sand drawing, symbolic of purity and especially associated with water. And this double, sometimes these are very simple. It's just a slash with two bars. That's the kind of representation. And the Zuni, again, the shamanistic creature was with supernatural power. So you can kind of see the split in terms of the regard for the animal. In terms of utility in society, there are a lot of cultures that eat dragonflies. Okay, so Africa, South America, Asia. I generally see they're referring to larvae, not the adults. And there are various recipes for charcoaling them or making a stew out of them. There are a number of other cultures who regard dragonflies as having medicinal properties in terms of folk medicine. And you can find a long list of ailments that eating, being near, making a broth out of dragonflies will cure. Just a few of those: headaches, indigestion, and fever. And again, there are some peoples that have used, in particular, tropical dragonflies with very colorful wings as ornaments. If we just deal with contemporary society, it's clear that dragonflies are actually regarded as highly as probably some of those other charismatic groups. And I'm going to say butterflies, ladybird beetles, and fireflies is up there being the kind of the most popular insects. So if you just go on the internet, you can find all sorts of references, lamps and stamps and IPAs and jewelry. Dragonfly pubs are really important, really prominent, as are dragonfly inns. The names of boats, a Vietnam era fighter plane was named the Dragonfly, sculpture, body art, and of course, dishes and coffee cup. And if someone gives me yet one more Dragonfly coffee cup, I will be able to open my own shop. So I always think it's useful to kind of look at the big picture in terms of the evolution of insects to see where it is that dragonflies sit. And as it turns out, they're amongst the most ancient of lineages. If we look way back here, about 425 million years, 415 million years ago, we find a critter appears in the fossil record that has jaws that are very similar to contemporary dragonflies. Now, this was not a dragonfly, but was probably ancestral. As it turns out, mayflies and dragonflies split off very early from the lineages to other insects. And many of the insects we know of today actually originated long after dragonflies were established. So again, that's the dragonfly lineage there. And you can see that there were some sister lineages here that have become extinct. Now, this is a critter that always appears on the internet as one of the first dragonflies. It's actually not a dragonfly. That is a griffin fly. And you can see from this is the actual fossil of Meganura. That's an artist's rendition of that fossil. And this is another one. So you can see it was very dragonfly-like, no question about it. What was different about it were a number of morphological features. But the other thing that was different about it is the size. Meganura was bigger than any insect that lives on the planet today, or maybe any insect that lived on the planet throughout history. So that's obviously not a real Meganura, that's a representation. Okay, so a really large animal. The largest insects we have on the planet today are about 10 size. Now, there are some Malaysian walking sticks that are very long, but in terms of heft, some of these South American longhorn beetles are a handful. And the situation is, this is about as large as an insect can get on the planet today because of the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere. It's only about 21%. Insects don't have lungs, they have tracheal systems. Basically, they have a system of air ducts running through the body. It's more passive than our tidal ventilation is. And there simply is not enough oxygen to support an insect this large, given its respiratory system. The first real dragonflies appear in the fossil record about 300 million years ago. So this fossil is about 300 million years, and you can see very clearly that this is a clubtail, a family of contemporary dragonflies. This is another fossil wing, so there's the impression, and here's an artist's tracing of that wing, so you can see it more clearly. And if I compare this hundreds million year old wing to a contemporary dragonfly wing, you can see they're really similar. I want to make the point here that we often think prehistoric dinosaurs. And the first dinosaurs appear, I don't know, about 245 million years ago. Dragonflies had already been around for 60 million years. They were already ancient when the first dinosaurs even appeared. So we're dealing with a really old group of critters. They've left a reasonable fossil record. Insects don't leave good fossils, but we can see that they've done that. You can see this 150 million year old fossil looks very dragonfly-like, as does this one, as does this more recent one, 25 million years in amber. To date, there are about 6,366 known species of dragonflies on the planet. I say about because it seems to me that almost every month a new species is discovered in Asia. So the number keeps going up slowly. They're generally divided into two suborders, the dragonflies, the Anisoptera, and the damselflies, the Zygoptera. There is a third suborder, these guys. There's only 3 species known, and there's a fourth that may be put in this group, but really right now it's 3. The Anisoptera are really closely related to dragonflies, but there are some features of them that are damselfly-like. And it may be that this group is actually the most ancient lineage of these 3. So how do you tell the difference between dragonflies and damselflies? I've had some people say, aren't damselflies baby dragonflies? No, they're not. Like most insects, once they're emerged, that's as big as they're going to get. Sorry. So generally in Maine, dragonflies are bigger than damselflies. Dragonflies tend to have not only larger bodies, but thicker abdomens in proportion to their body. Dragonflies have asymmetric wings. The forewings are longer and more narrow than the shorter, wider hind wings. Fly wings are pretty symmetrical. You don't see that difference between the two. Dragonflies can't fold their wings after they emerge. They rest and they perch with their wings open. Most damselflies, except one family, fold their wings over their abdomens like this. Dragonflies have proportionally larger eyes relative to the size of the head compared to damselflies. In fact, dragonflies have proportionally probably the largest eyes of any animal on the planet, certainly any insect on the planet. As you can see, this is the head of the dragonfly, and his eyes are really big. This is the head of the damselfly, and the eyes are big, but nowhere near proportionally as big. Dragonflies and damselflies have, for almost all species, aquatic larval forms. Right? So these guys are all aquatic critters. Now, I refer to them as larvae. In some of the literature, you'll see them referred to as nymphs. In older literature still, you'll see them referred to as naiads. But in the Northeast, the various families of dragonflies or damselflies are very easy to identify, at least to family. To species, more difficult. All of these guys are predators. There are no herbivorous dragonflies. As larvae, they are generalist predators. They will eat anything smaller than they are, or even the same size. Fish, salamanders, snails, and a variety of insect larvae. In some cases, other dragonfly larvae. All of them are equipped with this really neat, almost nightmarish feeding apparatus. So the actual mandibles are up here. The mouth is up here, but they've got this articulating appendage, which is sort of like a modified lower lip that is able to shoot out without the dragonfly moving, grab prey, and pull it back into the mandibles to consume. As you see, this little fish is being consumed right now. So as you can see here, here's a little larval, probably chironomid or something like that. Here's the jaw-like contraption is retracted here. It shoots out, grabs it, and then hauls it back to the mouth. So all of these larvae have that adaptation, which is interesting because that's not the way adults capture food. They don't capture food with their mouths. They capture food with their legs. It's a completely different strategy. Because they're arthropods, these guys, in order to grow, have to molt their exoskeleton and grow into the new one. And so we find generally, depending upon the species, there are 8 to 17 of these growth molts, 12 kind of the average. With each molt, they get larger. And the length of this period can be as short as 4 weeks for some species, as long as several years for other species. That's interesting because the adults, the flying adult dragonflies and damselflies, have lifespans of a couple of weeks to maybe 3 or 4 months at most. So about 90% of the lifespan of an odonate refers to damselflies or dragonflies, is spent in the water as an aquatic creature. With the last molt that the larva undergoes, it's ready to emerge. It crawls out of the water. That depends on the family. Crawls up onto something above the water and begins the molting process. And so basically the exoskeleton ruptures down the back. The emerging adult comes out, does a forward handspring and grabs on to its exoskeleton, which is firmly attached to the substrate. And it uses that as a base to begin pumping hemolymph, blood, and air through its body and into its wings to eventually get them to completely unfurl and begin hardening off before it's able to fly away. How long that takes can be a couple hours to most of the day, depending upon how humid it is, for example. What's left over is this thing, the last exoskeleton of the larva that we refer to as an exuvium. In terms of the anatomy, the external morphology of dragonflies and damselflies, typical insect head, thorax, which is the motor unit, the legs and the wings are attached to the thorax, and the abdomen. The abdomen in both damselflies and dragonflies has 10 separate segments with terminal appendages associated with the final segment. Vision in these guys is really cool. Like most arthropods, they have compound eyes, which you can see represented here. Dragonflies in particular, those eyes are huge. They're composed of 25 to 30,000 facets, which are technically called ommatidium singular. So if you look at this close up, you can see each of those little hexagonal units that compose the eye. And those little units, though each ommatidium is really an optical subunit. It has its own lens. It has its own nerve that's going to feed the optic nerve. It has various pigments and so forth. So it sort of functions as a kind of little miniature eye. Dragonflies, not damselflies, have almost a 360-degree field of view. A dragonfly's only real blind spot is behind and below it. But those eyes kind of wrap all the way around. I'm trying to imagine the central nervous system that can process that kind of information. They have excellent visual acuity. Unlike you, they see not only visible light, but also polarized and ultraviolet light. And as you can see in this animal, in terms of the pigment difference, and in this animal, I'll show you a different picture in a minute, they actually have a part of the eye that's known as the fovea. Let me just switch. Yep. I don't know what I was doing there. So you can see the ommatidia here and the ommatidia here are different. These are much larger, and this isn't the whole top of the eye. It's really just about the anterior half, upper half of the eye on both sides. And the reason they have this has to do with how dragonflies hunt. Dragonflies have this wonderfully sophisticated evolutionary adaptation that allows them to assess in less than a second whether a potential prey item is worth pursuing or not. They're able to, and this looks highly complicated, and the reason I'm showing you this is because of the time intervals here. When a dragonfly sees a potential prey item, it does one quick look at it, right? And then it tries to track it using the fovea, the upper part of its compound eyes. And at that point, in about 140 milliseconds, it makes the decision whether to go or no go. And what it does is something cool. It tracks the prey using the fovea so that as it computes an intercept path from the insect prey's perspective, it's not moving. It looks like it's getting bigger, but it's not like moving like this until it actually intercepts the prey item. So we often think of mammalian predators being really efficient predators. But as it turns out, they're not. Wolves' success rate is about 14%. Lions, 17 to 25. Your cat, your domestic cat, which is why they should be indoors, is more successful than lions are at hunting. Cheetahs have the highest percent, 58%. But it pales in comparison to dragonflies. Under different circumstances, their success rate is 83 to 95%, in part because they make the decision of whether to go or no go based on the vector math that their nervous system is doing in terms of potential prey items. In addition to the compound eyes, dragonflies and damselflies have 3 simple eyes, ocelli. Those eyes are capable of seeing probably light, dark, and shadow, and are probably important in terms of maintaining light stability when the animal is in motion. In terms of actual flight, dragonflies have 2 pairs of wings that move independently of one another. You can see that in this wonderful sequence here. They are highly maneuverable. They can fly backwards, sideways, forward. They can hover. Some insects can't do that. I see in the literature dragonflies being, clocked at 50 or 60 miles an hour. There's no reputable scientific evidence that any dragonfly can fly that fast. The fastest I've seen recorded 25 to 35 miles an hour. Probably they cruise at about 10. Damselflies don't fly anywhere near that fast. They are, and I hate to use the term weaker flyers because damselflies don't do what dragonflies do. Their biology differs in terms of their foraging tactics. Damselflies and dragonflies are largely heliophiles. They love the sun. There are some species that hunt at dusk, but basically at night, they roost. And interestingly, they don't roost near water. They leave the water. They leave the shoreline and may go 100 or a couple of 100 meters inland, where they basically find, depending upon the species, some vegetation, usually herbaceous vegetation. In the case of dragonflies, usually something with a stiff stem. And they hang up, and that's where they spend the night. We think of monarchs as being these wonderful generational migrants, and they are. But we also have dragonflies that are migratory. And this one, the common green darner, is one of the early ones that we see in Maine. So I'm going to start in May because we first start seeing these guys the first week in May sometime, May 7th, May 8th, right? They didn't emerge here. They emerged way down south, and they have flown up here. So what happens is this: the common green darners that arrive here in May feed, mate, breed, and die. Their offspring emerge later in the summer, feed, and begin moving south. They continue feeding. They get in the southern part of the country. They breed. They die. Their offspring emerge, and they don't migrate. They feed. They breed. They die. Their offspring make the trip north again. So we have generation that migrates north, a generation that migrates south, and a generation that's not migratory. And that's sort of the pattern for migrants. At least 16 species of North American dragonflies migrate, and sometimes in such dense numbers that they show up on radar as big clouds of probably millions of animals migrating. This is the kind of the supreme migratory dragon. This is the wandering glider. We have wandering gliders in Maine. They have all sorts of migratory routes, but the migratory route they make between the Indian subcontinent and Africa means that some of these animals, individual animals, fly almost 4,000 miles themselves. Now, people often ask me about swarms of dragonflies. And so how do you tell the difference between a migratory swarm and any other kind of swarm, which is usually a feeding swarm? And in migratory swarms, which usually occur in the fall, the animals tend to be moving in one direction. In feeding swarms, they're flying all over the place, and you can actually see them hawking insects. And so what draws a migratory, excuse me, a feeding swarm to your backyard is a concentration of little flies, midges, maybe mosquitoes, although I'm going to comment on that, little moths, little mayflies, anything where prey is congregated, you will tend to have feeding assemblages form. If we look at dragonflies in terms of sex differences, what we find are females tend to have wider, more robust abdomens. Males have secondary sexual organs right there. Females do not. In some species, females are different color. Eastern forktail, very common species, kind of a weed species. If you want to think about that in Maine, these are all the townships been recorded in. Very differently colored than the immature female or even the mature female. So in some cases, it's really hard to tell the difference between sexes based on color. In other cases, it's quite striking. This is a pair of boreal bluets. You can see they both have black and blue color. Slight differences in the female, but what I'm really trying to demonstrate here is the tandem linkage. This male has grasped a female behind the head, and that's how dragonflies and damselflies get dates. A male grabs a female. And they do that with these kind of marvelous little terminalia. And I'm going to show you an electron micrograph kind of at an obtuse angle. So you can see that there's not two of these. There's actually a pair of cerci and a pair of these paraprox. And you can consider these the keys. And these keys have to fit into specific locks in terms of the mesothoracic plates of the female. Now, these are two different species. This is Hagani and this is Ebrium. So this is Hagani. This key will not fit this lock, but that key will. And so it's a way of maintaining reproductive isolation. Generally, males can't latch on to a female of a different species successfully. So males kind of initiate the contact, but females control it. Unless a female brings her reproductive organs in contact with the male's secondary sexual organs, there is no copulation. The male will wait a given amount of time, and then if the female is not interested, he will let her go and go looking for another date. Once they have copulated, because females' eggs tend to be fertilized mostly by the last male she's copulated with, males tend to guard females. And one of the principal ways is simply to hang on to her while she oviposits. This female is cutting a little slit in the underside of this leaf and depositing an egg there. And this male is going to stay attached to her. And if we see this particular strategy practice a variety of different species, if the males don't stay attached, as they don't in some species, they typically are hovering nearby to drive other males off. So mate guarding is very, very widespread in the Odonata. The eggs will hatch eventually into a prolarva, and when they hatch depends upon the species. Sometimes it's a very short period of time. Sometimes the eggs overwinter and don't hatch till the following spring. What emerges from the eggs is this thing called a prolarva, and it basically quickly assumes the form of that first larval stage. And then the cycle continues. So North America, we've got 477 known odonate species. In Maine, we have 161. That is phenomenal. We have 1/3 of the entire North American odonate fauna in Maine. And just to make my point here, California is 5 times the size of Maine and has 1/3 less odonates. Italy is 9 times the size of Maine and has even fewer odonates. And the reason we have so many odonates is we have such a breadth of different kinds of wetland habitats, lakes and ponds and streams and rivers and bogs and seeps and swamps. All of those things can be generally used by all odonates, there are some odonates, but are specialized on by other odonates. I'm just going to quickly run through some of our families. I'm not going to go through a whole 161 species, just to give you a flavor for the diversity of odonate fauna. So these are the broadwings, the Colopterigidae. They are the 3 green ones are referred to as the jewel wings. If you ever encounter these streams with overhanging foliage, a great place to find them. Spectacularly iridescent. There are only 4 species known to Maine, so these are the 4. There's a 5th that we think might be here, but it's not been confirmed. Second family of damselflies are the pond damsels, the Synagrion. I often ask people if they've seen these, and they say, oh yeah, those little blue and black ones, I've seen them. Really? You sure? Because there's a lot of blue and black damselflies in Maine. And some of these, you literally have to look at the terminalia to make the distinction in terms of species. You really can't eyeball it. And there are some that aren't blue and black. They're still called bluets for the most part. So this is the scarlet bluet. This is the orange bluet, right? This is the, oops, sorry, I'm over here. This is the Vesper bluet, this yellow and blue and black one. The third family of damselflies are the spread wings. So I said, remember, most damselflies fold their wings, but these guys don't quite do it. They don't hold them out like a dragonfly. They sort of hold them like this, right? And hence the term spread wing. We have 10 species of these. They contrast in terms very markedly in terms of how the other damselflies hold their wings when they're at rest. And oftentimes when they first emerge, they have a nice metallic color. So those are 3 damselfly families. We have 6 dragonfly families. The Asianids, these are the darners. They generally are dark bodied with a patterning of green and blue or yellow in some cases. And many of them look quite similar, except for maybe these 2. There's 2 species that look like this. They're basically brown with yellow markings. And the family includes our 2 largest dragonflies, the common green darner, which I talked about as being a migrant, and the spectacular comet darner, which is rarely seen by most people. The next family are the clubtails, so-called because they have a club. This is one of my favorites, Hygenius brevistylis. Common name is the dragon hunter because it eats, yes, other dragonflies. Most of the clubtails dark-bodied with green or yellow markings. Most of them have clubs of varying sizes, although there's some, like these 2 species, where it's not very discernible. The next family are the Cordulidae, the emeralds. This group is called the emeralds because of those eyes. Now, interestingly, not all of them have emerald colored eyes, but many species do. Species in this family, so it's a fairly prestigious group, oftentimes dark-bodied, oftentimes with some metallic coloration here and here. Again, metallic coloration, metallic coloration. One of our smaller families, the spiketails. Dark bodies, bright yellow to yellowish white markings. Very, those are the only 3 species we have in Maine. Our smallest family are the cruisers, only 2 species. Didymops transversa on the left, Macromia illinoisis on the right. This is one of the earliest emerging dragonflies we have in Maine. And finally, our largest family, the skimmers, Libellulae, 39 species, all sorts of colors, all sorts of sizes, all sorts of wing patterns. So these are commonly called the white faces because, well, they have white faces. And this is probably the most common one that people see. Many of the skimmers are like this one. This is the one we already talked about, the wandering glider, that magnificent migratory species, Libellula pulchella, with these spotted wings. This guy is a corporal, right? White corporal because of its stripes. Small eastern amberwing, the widow skimmer. Again, lots of different patterns would make them easier to identify for most people than many of the groups. Our smallest dragonfly, about this big. Okay. Nenothemis bella. Again, lots and lots of different wing patterns. And we have a collection of 6 or 7 of these species. These are the kind of late summer, fall meadowhawk species. Most of them are red. There is one species, the black meadowhawk, which is, as you would guess, black. I'm going to say a little bit about rarity. This pair, and again, you can always tell, there's the male will be in front, he's grasping the female, of dusky dancers, is perching cooperatively on my hand. And it's only known from a few townships in Maine on one flowage. I know because I got them all, right? And so in Maine, this is a really rare species. That said, it is not a rare species in North America. It's found in almost every state east of the Mississippi and some states that aren't, and actually down through Central America into northern South America. So you have to be careful with the term rarity in terms of being clear what it means. From a state perspective, it's a rare species. This beautiful cherry red bluet, I know it seems contradictory, the scarlet bluet, is found in a bunch of townships in Maine. My students and I surveyed in 2018, 2019, and found over 50 sites where it's breeding, all the way to the Canadian border. And as it turns out, just over the border now. This is the entire global range of that species. It is found no place else on the planet except there. And over half of the breeding sites for this globally rare species are in New Hampshire and Maine. So that is an actual rare species. And in fact, Maine has 3 endemic northeastern species of damselflies. The scarlet bluet, the New England bluet, and again, this is the entire global range for the New England bluet. It's not even found in Canada, although I suspect it's across the border just barely. And the little bluet, which is found on almost every place we look in Maine. It's also found in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia too. But again, it looks like Maine is the center of the metapopulation of the entire species on the planet. This is the ring bog hunter. It's one of 2 threatened species in Maine as official listing. We have 2 threatened species, 17 species of special concern, and 10 species of greatest conservation concern. And again, the IFW determines those rankings. Well, we've sort of already covered this. we know that as larvae, dragonflies and damselflies are really important in aquatic food webs as predators. What we didn't really talk about is they're equally important as prey. Lots of things eat the larvae. Fish eat the larvae, water birds eat the larvae, crayfish eat the larvae. When they finally emerge as flying adults, they're important as predators. They eat they're generalist predators, just like the larvae are. But they're equally important as prey items. Spiders, other predatory insects, birds, frogs will leap at them, fish will leap at them as they're trying to breed. In more southern climates, reptiles, okay? I love this picture, beautiful picture of European bee eaters. Taken in Hungary, and you can see what they're eating pretty clearly. And just to make a point again, there were lots of pterosaurs that were not very big, and they were probably hunting dragonflies 150 million years ago. But in addition to that, dragonflies and damselflies are important indicators of the integrity of freshwater habitats, in part because of their roles in the food webs. We've already talked about that, both as prey and predators, but also because they have a reliance on a healthy nearshore aquatic vegetation community. They need it for egg laying. They need it for larval habitat. They need it in some species as emergent habitat using emergent vegetation. But they also have a heavy reliance on terrestrial shoreline habitat, riparian habitat, because they use that to feed, they use that to perch. So, for example, this whole family doesn't fly around like the darners. They perch and wait for prey. They don't patrol looking for prey. They also need perches to actually copulate. And they shelter from at night. They shelter from wind and rain in the riparian habitat along the shoreline. And finally, we have some species as larvae that are sensitive to certain kinds of water pollutants. So again, important in terms of habitat integrity and the health of that habitat. So this will be a habitat for some kind of odonate species, usually multiple species. So you pick it and you find odonates associated with it. If we look at species diversity, we find that lakes and ponds have the highest diversity. Slow streams, the second highest, and then it kind of goes down through marshes and peatlands all the way to just seepages, which have a unique little damselfly, and that's the only place in Maine that you find them, is in these little seepages. So our major conservation concerns: shoreline habitat disturbance, the loss of nearshore aquatic vegetation through raking, and you are by law able to rake clearance to swimming areas or boat launching areas, but not your entire property. And spraying, which hopefully doesn't happen in Maine, but does happen in other states. But also the loss of shoreline vegetation for the reasons I described, really critical. Public access and water quality. Maine is really lucky. Most of our lakes are well buffered by forest. That's not the case in many states. Many states have lakes that look like this, where there's a little bit of buffer, but not much buffer around the rest of the lake, lots of access. And as a result, usually not effluent, hopefully not a direct effluent contamination, but it's usually non-point source runoff, particularly of nitrates. In agricultural contexts, we can also have runoff from pesticides. Lots of studies out showing now what climate change is doing to a wide range of insects. And of course, introduced species, introduced plant species, introduced animal species. So that's a good segue into my, I am winding up, I promise, into the question I'm always asked: dragonflies as mosquito controls. So if you go on the internet, you can read things like dragonflies eat their weight in mosquitoes every day. Not true. Absolutely untrue. Dragonflies don't eat their weight in anything. People have actually measured what dragonflies eat. They eat about 15% of their mass each day, not their entire body mass. Not mosquitoes. Oh, they eat mosquitoes. Don't get me wrong. Recent study used immunoplots to test for mosquito proteins in the guts of 5 different genera of insects. Only 10% of the dragonflies they looked at had been eating mosquitoes. The rest were eating other things. So there's no evidence that dragonflies can control mosquitoes except in really small, like cistern type situations where the larvae can apparently control. Introducing dragonflies from other states is dangerous for dragonflies that live here, because these guys have been around, let me remind you, for 300 million years. They will have colonized every habitat that is accessible at the density that will support dragonfly populations. Dumping more critters into the system is not helping your native dragonflies, because it is undoubtedly going to reduce the prey availability for the dragonflies that are already there. Moreover, we run the risk of introducing new species to the dragonfly fauna of Maine that may outcompete some of our native species. And this is a point I always have to make to people. Remember, I said dragonflies are generalist predators. They are not, underline, not mosquito hawks. They do eat mosquitoes. They do eat midges. They do eat deer flies. But they will eat anything that flies, including many native pollinators, native bees, honeybees, bumblebees, butterflies, moths. Everything is on the table. There are records of big common green darners taking hummingbirds. So when you introduce them, don't think mosquito hawk. And then finally, I'll just point out it's illegal without a permit from IFW, and I believe IFW is only giving out permits to 3 towns right now, and those towns are required to obtain their larvae from commercial suppliers in Massachusetts. So we're probably getting about the same species that are already here. It's still not a good idea, and it still doesn't actually control mosquitoes, but I also get the question, how can I get more dragonflies on my property? Well, make some habitat for them. Okay, create a small pond, make sure you have plants, you will have dragonflies. I've seen dragonflies checking out a window I had on sawhorses to paint because of the reflection of the sun off the surface. It looked like water. Okay? If you build it, they will come. Finally, just let me give you some resources if you want to go maintain this and 2 other websites for the state. These pull down menus will give you lots of resources. Just search Maine Damselfly and Dragonfly, it'll come up. If I was going to own any one book, and the book we're working on wasn't available yet, it probably won't be for 2 years, I would own this book. Dennis Paulson's Damselflies and Dragonflies of the East, fabulous book. If I was going to own a second book, it would be Ed Lamb's Damselfly book. Both really great resources. That said, these are also very good. Okay. But if you had one, this is the one you would get. And they're also available for Kindle and tablets. I got them on everything. So I heartily recommend this phone app. It's free. You can get it at the Odonata Central website, or I think in the Play Store. It's available for both iPhones and Androids. It's a really cool app. I suggest getting familiar with iNaturalist. I pulled this up the other day, and you can see there's like 10,354 observations for 151 of the 161 species we have in Maine. Okay. And it's growing in popularity. People learn how to use it and they post their observations. And importantly, we science folks harvest those data because we have the species record proof, we have the location, we have the date. Those are all important data. So those are some sources you can use that are pretty accessible if you want to really get into dragonflies and damselflies more. In closing, I just want to thank my many collaborators, both collaborators on other projects and collaborators on the book we're doing. And most importantly, the really great, patient, fieldwork loving UMF students that have worked with me on the dragonfly projects and the butterfly projects and the grasshopper projects and the bumblebee projects and all the other projects we've done. I couldn't have done any of this without their help and support. So with that, I'm happy to entertain additional questions if anybody has them.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That was amazing. I learned so much. We do definitely have some questions that have come in. I'll start with the first set that kind of have to do with dragonfly habits. So one is, how did researchers figure out how to study the dragonfly's hunting patterns?
So people have approached it in a variety of different ways, but dragonflies are so fast, it's difficult to record visually what they're doing. And so what people have resorted to is high-speed cinematography that we can slow down our speed and actually figure out what the dragonflies are doing. Because they're making, their go, no-go decision is made in less than a second. I mean, how do you measure that? So that's been done with this really ultra slow motion photography, mostly.
That's awesome. Thank you. One is, is there a benefit for the migratory dragonflies to migrate, and why not just stick around in the same spot?
So there's a couple of lines of reasoning here. One is that this is a holdover from the last glaciation where some species moved, some species didn't. The ones that didn't survive, and they've recolonized as the glaciers receded. But the other ones that got in this kind of, they were selected evolutionarily to do the moving thing, started going back and forth. But a different way to look at it is the same reason why do birds migrate south in the winter, but some don't, they stay here. Well, if you stay here and there's a limited amount of food, you can have an advantage if you can go farther south where there's more food. And so the pattern for in terms of reducing competition locally by actually leaving. Now, what the steps were evolutionarily in terms of how that happened, I don't know. Was it baby steps, just a little migration, just a little bit farther south, and it just got more and more exaggerated over time? It's just not clear.
We had a question about the coloring on the wings, and does that serve any purpose to have that coloring?
Yeah, so there are a wide variety of things that help species maintain reproductive isolation. So a female of one species recognizes a male of another species in part by his behavior, but in part because of his coloration. And so that color pattern is probably a sexually selected trait to make sure that males and females of the right species get together.
Do any of them sting or bite?
Any insect that has mandibles can bite. Have I ever been bitten by a dragonfly? No. Have I ever stuck my finger in a dragonfly's mouth? No. Do I know people who have? Yes. Did they get bitten? Yes. So normally I don't collect them. I photograph them, and I net them sometimes, and I have to take them out to examine them, but then I let them go. But you have to be careful when you take them out of the net because they're biting at the net. And I've seen people literally pull their heads off because they didn't let go. Right. But I've put dragonflies on my hands thousands of times. They don't start biting, they fly away, right? I mean, there's much the same thing with bees. A lot of bees, you can just shake out in your palm. They're not there. They're not going to sting you. They just fly away. Wasps, you need to be a little more careful with, but that's. Oh, and stinging. I've had people say, "Oh, I got stung by a dragonfly." So what happens is this: some of the females have female dragonflies in particular have a spiky ovipositor, because what they do with that ovipositor is they slap it down into mud or decaying vegetation, and every time they do, they deposit an egg. Well, I've had people have dragonflies land on their pants and start crawling up them, and what the females are doing is trying to oviposit, but it's a little spiky thing, so it might feel like a little prick every time that happens. And I think that's what happens. It's rare. It's rare.
Do you find it easier to ID dragonflies or damselflies?
So what happens when you work with a group of bugs for a long time is they're doing a lot of things subconsciously. Like I know it is, but if you ask me why I know what it is, I'm my subconscious is saying, "Oh, click, 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 click." It's that, right? That said, there's some things I have to get in hand to actually look at structures up close. For example, some of the club tails, I actually had to net them and look at the reproductive structures to be absolutely sure. A couple of species of damselflies, I have to look at them really carefully to be sure. Others are, you can tell 20 feet away what it is. I mean, it just practice, practice, practice.
I think, let's see, that's just about it for questions, but maybe I think the question that we were talking about before we started, can you share, I know you have the butterfly book coming out very soon. Could you share some details about that?
Yeah, the butterfly book, again, so let me differentiate. The dragonfly book is going to be much more guide oriented than the butterfly books. That said, we have all 121 species from the Acadian region. So I'm talking about Maine, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island. Nice, fabulous pictures. I wish I could take pictures like these guys do. Species accounts describing them, describing their habitats, their conservation concerns, and maps and flight period graphs so you can see when you're most likely to encounter them. So all the species accounts, like sort of guide-like, are presented. But we also spent some time looking at the history of the study of butterflies in the region. There are lots of really famous historical figures that contributed a lot of historical data. We did a bunch of analyses and made them approachable for the common reader, looking at how many new records and town records, new species we added to the list, because we added new species to the list that weren't recorded in New England before, or at least not in the Maine and the Maritimes. We did some analyses of how climate change is altering the breeding, the timing of breeding in some of these species, and it is, as we know what's happening around the world. We go through a list of the species that are likely to occur in Maine and the Maritimes in their near future as the climate continues to change. We provided photographs of each of those so people can start being on the lookout. we describe habitats for listed species, that are species that have one of those designations from IFW or the Canadian provincial governments, and conservation issues associated with each of those habitats in the region. And then we kind of in the last chapter, we went through some of the species that people have reported in Maine that when we actually went and looked at the photographs or the actual specimens in museums, we discovered were identified. Well, those species were inaccurate. We can't say the species was never here, but we suspect they were never here. So it's a book that some really prominent butterfly people in North America gave really high reviews to. So but I think if you and I think it's already listed for pre-order on Amazon. Although I don't think they put the cover with it yet. I think it's just a blank cover saying cover will be coming. So that should appear in a couple of weeks. But it's a book I wish I had 20 years ago, to be honest. It would have made learning butterflies way easier.
Well, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. We'll be sending out an email to folks who attended tonight with links to the presentation, and then we'll include copies of the names of some of those books and the apps that you recommended. And yeah, thank you so much, Ron, for all of the time that you just spent and all of the amazing information that you just shared. It was awesome. So
my pleasure. And if people have additional questions, I'm at butler@maine.edu. Happy to answer them.
thank you. So this, I guess, closes off our evening, and I hope everyone has a lovely night.
Take care, folks.